Hello, it's me, Cursive Cass, and I am back on YouTube with another video. This one's going to be a longer one. I'm going to do some palmistry for absolute beginners. This is absolute basics. I do want to preface this video with there are multiple different ways to read palms depending on who taught you and where you learned. So this is just the way that I personally do it. If you do it a different way, that is beautiful and valid. So probably chances are if you're reading palms, you're going to want to know which hand do I even start with, right? And I think that that's a fair question to have. So for me personally, this depends on reader. Some people believe that it doesn't matter. Some people believe or do it by gender. I personally do it by hand dominance. So I am right hand dominant. So I'm going to be speaking in terms of me. If you are not a righty, if you're a lefty, you're going to want to hear this backwards. And if you're ambidextrous, I don't really know what to tell you. I haven't had that come up for me yet. So nevertheless, for me, since this is my dominant hand, this would represent my past and my present. Meanwhile, this one would be more representative of my future. Other people read it differently. This just depends. I see right hand as more or less of what you were given, and left hand is more of what you will do. But they're both valid, and honestly, it just depends on the reader. If you only have one hand, then chances are that's the hand that you're going to read. If you don't have any palms, I don't know why you're watching this video. I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but if you don't have hands, it's going to be very hard to read your palms, unfortunately. Without further ado, let's get into the rest of the video. All right, so this first thing is going to be about ultimately comparing your hand size to itself. That didn't make a lot of sense, so I'm going to try to clarify really quick. Ultimately, this is done by comparing the length of your fingers to the length of your palm. You can usually kind of eyeball it. If you have fingers that are significantly longer than your palm, for example, then you probably have an air hand. Vice versa, you would have a fire hand, and so forth. Just kind of compare it to the other hands you've seen. You can kind of eyeball this and it'll be okay. So for me personally, I have a fire hand. This is because I have a longer palm and shorter fingers. Regarding these, it's going to be important to kind of understand the elemental correspondences and what these elements mean. So for example, if someone has earth hands, they're likely to be stable and more grounded. If someone has a fire hand like me, they're more likely to be direct and challenging, and typically fire hands like myself will have more prominent creases, which makes it actually a lot easier to read. And that makes my hand a good example to look at for this purpose, which helps me a lot actually. Water hands tend to be more emotional, more in that internal world, more sensitive, and air signs tend to be more talkative, or air hands. See, it's very similar to astrology when you get to this point as well. So if you understand what it means to be an air sign, you're going to understand what it means to have an air hand. Similar kind of concept. Air hands tend to be more intellectual and more talkative and all that fun stuff. Once again, these aren't hard and fast rules. Like for example, not all Geminis are two-faced, same kind of thing. Or not all Tauruses are lazy, or just, you know, all that kind of stuff. So these aren't like hard and fast rules, but they are good guidelines to get started with. So going from here, we're going to talk about the lines on your hands. We're just going to talk about the main four. The heart line, the headline, the lifeline, and the fate line. There are multiple other lines on your hands that a reader may choose to read, and I may do some more, I guess, specific videos about those lines. But I'm just going to go over these main four because this is very much a beginner-friendly video. So first up, you're going to have your heart line right here. So this first line, the heart line, is more or less about your emotional style, how you love, and how you express your feelings. So without further ado, there are also differences in other people's heart lines, and so I'm going to be talking a little bit about those. There are many different types of heart lines. I'm just going to be talking about three. If yours doesn't apply, I suggest you do further research, or I can make this whole separate video just about the heart line. So if your heart line is just straight across, you may be more of a stoic person. You may tend to be quieter, or just quieter about your emotions at least, and you may tend to kind of have a hard time expressing those. If it's more arched, then you may you may be a little more emotional. That tends to be a sign of balance and a sign of an emotionally fit and well person, or someone who is actually able to regulate their own emotions relatively easily and relatively safely as well. But if it arches all the way up to be in between your fingers, that can be a sign of someone who is very nurturing and very giving to an extreme level. That may actually put you at risk for being taken advantage of and being used. The length can also kind of tell you some things, like if it's shorter, you may be a kind of quieter person, a less loving person at least, or quieter about that, or a person who tends to hide their emotions more. A longer one, you may be walked over. Then you're going to have your headline right here. So next up, we're going to talk about the headline, which really represents your thought processes, how you think, and all that fun stuff. Typically, a long and deep headline is the best one to have, or one of the better ones to have, as this indicates a smart person who's capable of maintaining a long conversation that is thought-provoking. If it's broken, it may kind of indicate glitchy thinking patterns or glitchy communication patterns, especially if it breaks off before your pinky. For others, a shorter headline tends to represent a person who struggles more with communication and struggles more with those thought processes, while a longer one tends to express more of a sophisticated thinker and communicator. And so typically that's how the headline is received and what it means for people. These are just some of the types of headlines that you can have. There are others as well, and there are other significant factors. However, I will not be covering those in this video because, once again, this is more or less basics. So nevertheless, we shall be moving on. And now we'll talk about our lifeline right here. Your lifeline is more or less representative of your vitality and your life. However, having a short one doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to die young, although it can mean that in certain contexts. Typically, a lifeline is more or less representative of both your health to an extent, as well as your life and how you plan to move forward with it, or how you're going to move forward with it. So typically, a strong headline will represent a more dependable person, while a broken headline may represent a person who is less dependable, or it may even just represent more career changes. Like for a person who has one long, solid one, they're likely to be correct about the career they've chosen. Meanwhile, for people who have a broken one, or a faint one, or a short one, they may not be so much. They may not be as steady and stable in that environment, or as, I guess, clear about what they want to do with their life. They may have a lot more major life changes. You can kind of look at some of the breaks and figure out when those life changes are going to occur. And I think that that's really cool personally, because once you get good enough at it, you can kind of tell like when these major life changes are going to occur. So without further ado, we are going to move on to the fate line next. I hope this helps. And then we're going to talk about our fate line. Unfortunately, I don't have a solid fate line on my hand, but you will see it on the infographic that I'm going to post. Mine would be around here, but it's not a prominent fate line by any means. Fate line is more or less representative of your money and your life aspirations, unlike the lifeline where it's more about your health and how your life is going to go. But the fate line's more about how you're going to, I guess, sort of move with that life, if that makes sense, or how your career is going to take you. If you don't have one, like I barely have one, it's not that big of a deal. It just means that you're more likely to let life kind of take you as it comes, or have several career changes in your life. For someone with a strong one, it can represent potential wealth, or having a steady career and being right in that in the first place. If you're lucky enough to have a double fate line, which does occur, that's typically a signifier of wealth in this person's life and a signifier of potential fame. Most people have one, not everyone does though, and that's okay too. Next up, we're going to talk about mounds and how the mounds on your hands work. You're going to be better off actually kind of cupping your hand or the person's hand that you are reading to kind of look at those mounds and see where's more prominent, where's flatter, and all of that fun stuff. I will have some infographics showing where exactly each one is, and I'm going to discuss them over top of those, so I hope y'all enjoy. This is the Mount of Luna as symbolized by the red little moon symbol, and nevertheless, a pronounced or prominent mount here can represent a person who is very intuitive and imaginative and has a very rich inner world. Typically, that's what that will mean. An underdeveloped one may mean a person who is not quite so in touch with that. Next up, we'll be talking about the Mount of Venus as shown by the red little Venus symbol. So a Mount of Venus, when it is prominent, can represent a person who is attractive or viewed as attractive by the members of their desired sex. And it represents someone who may be very fortunate and lucky in love and be very interested in that. Meanwhile, if that is not developed, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to find love or anything like that. But it can represent somebody who is either less interested in that or struggles more in that department. So next up, we're going to talk about the Mount of Jupiter. So this one's often not quite ego-based, but it's more about how you carry yourself. So typically, someone with a more pronounced Mount of Jupiter will have more pride in themselves and carry themselves in a more dignified way. They may also be more humanitarian than someone with a underdeveloped mound. An underdeveloped mound probably struggles a little bit more with their self-worth, and they may be a little more inside themselves and a little less, I guess, interested in helping other people and carrying themselves in a way that other people see as respectable. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and this doesn't mean that they cannot develop these skills later on. It just means that it's something that they're not as interested in as somebody with, or they're not as naturally adept to it as people with a larger Jupiter mound. Next up, we'll be talking about the Mount of Saturn, which is located directly under your middle finger, where the symbol for Saturn is on this picture. So if you have a highly developed one, chances are you are more patient and have more integrity. Meanwhile, if yours is underdeveloped or dips in, mine personally dips in, which I guess explains a lot about me. But nevertheless, if yours dips in, then that signifies a more impatient person, somebody who's less hardworking and wants what they want now, instead of being willing to wait for what they want and willing to work slowly towards their goals. Next up, the Mount of Apollo tends to tell us about how someone is aesthetically inclined. If you have a well-developed one, you're likely to be emotionally quite even-tempered, and you probably have quite an affinity for the arts. You're probably a creative or someone who in general really likes that and has a lot of appreciation for the arts. Meanwhile, if you have an underdeveloped or more flat one, chances are you aren't super into that. That's not really your thing. And that's okay too, but ultimately this is kind of a signifier of creativity and appreciation for the aesthetics and appreciation for the arts, as well as it can also represent temperament to an extent. Next up, we're going to talk about the Mount of Mercury, which is beneath your pinky finger. And this mount tends to be indicative of how someone is going to communicate and that kind of deal. So ultimately, if you have a higher Mount of Mercury, chances are you're very witty. If you have a more pronounced one, very witty, has a love for language and enjoys banter. But if it's too prominent, then that may even indicate someone who's all bark, no bite, as in they're not really putting the actions behind their words, but they're saying these words. If it is lower, it may indicate someone who's not as good with language and not as adept with words, as it can also represent someone who's more negative and quieter. And next up, as you'll see, we do spend a lot of time talking about our palm, but our fingers are also important and they are also sectioned to mean certain things. So I'm going to go ahead and get into that as well. So you may want to look at the sections on your fingers. You'll see that they section into 3 sections, except on your thumb, which sections into 2, and your thumb's a little bit different. You may want to get more acquainted with astrology, because ultimately the higher these sections, the more ties you're going to have to those astrological signs, or the more prominent that section in your finger is, the more ties you're going to have to that astrological section. For your thumb, it is signifying of will and logic, so I would just kind of look and see how prominent and how large those spots are as well to determine that. Well, that was a bit of a long video, so thank you all for enduring this, and I really hope that you guys all enjoyed this video, and hopefully you'll learn something new out of it. And once again, it's okay to read palms a different way than I do. So I hope that you've all enjoyed this. I hope that you've all learned something, and I hope that you all have a blessed day.